Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, part one of a two-part series, I'm going to show you how I slow stitch an Autumn Treasures sampler. Now this is where I have odds and ends that I attach to my page to make a little sampler. Think of like a paint sampler or even a cabinet of curiosities. Each square has a different little image on it, and these images can be found objects, modified objects, or something that you create. In today's video, I'm going to go over the different objects and show you how I create a handful of them. I have previous videos as well that I'll link to below for more in-depth instructions on those objects. The idea is that we're going to pull out the colors and shapes and textures of fall and use them in our work. So let's get started.
So to get started, the hardest part for me was figuring out what size sampler I wanted to make. Everything is easily modifiable, so you can make a really small sampler or a large one. I'm making a rather large one for me. This is approximately 10 inches by 10 inches square, and I have a little bit of an edge here. My intention eventually is to bind this into a big fabric book. So I'm starting out by making the pages first. This is a piece of quilted fabric. You can use any type of fabric. My edges are rough. You can stitch around them if you want. I don't like to do that. I like to play around and make my design and figure out how I want this piece to look. I don't mind the rough edges. If you do, however, then you'll want to stitch around it first. After you create the size sampler you want, you need to figure out what size of the little samples you want to put in your sampler. I decided on a 2-inch square, so I just cut this out of some corrugated cardboard, because each of my sampler squares are going to have a backing. So I figured I could do 4 across and 4 tall. It would be 16. And I like that grid pattern. You don't have to do that. You can modify it. You can leave it blank in some areas. You could fill it in with something else if you want. And that's what I mean about this being very easily modifiable. So after you've decided on your sampler size for each sampler piece, as well as your whole piece, now the fun begins. You want to choose your samples as well as your fabrics. Now I'll show you some samples that are kind of found objects. I'll show you some easily modifiable things to put in your sampler, and I'll show you some techniques and review some that I've already done to put in that sampler. So for right now, I'm going to set aside my page. I'm not going to use this for a little bit. Now, because this is an autumn sampler, I specifically looked for colors of fabric and very simple patterns that I could use for the background pieces of the sample. So I found a lot of earth tones. Because I wanted them to be 2-inch, I took each of the colors that I wanted for the background. Now, you could plan this ahead of time. I just made a bunch of each of the colors. I wanted this yellow one to be my major color, so I made more of those than the others, and I have extra fabric. So if I feel that I need more of one color, I can go back in and make some more. But all I did was I took my template and I folded my fabric in half because it just was less cutting. Using this heat erasable pen, I just drew that square. And you don't even have to be that precise. And then I wanted to use the pinking shears because I like that little edge. I just think it looks like a fabric sampler. And from there, I just cut around each of the lines. And again, I'm not taking it terribly seriously, trying to get it square. But if it's not perfect, it's not perfect. You can modify it if you want, but now I have my squares. So then from here, we want to attach things to these squares. Now, I don't like to jump right in and attach things right away. I like to make an assortment of things that I can attach. Some things you might want to attach directly, so play around with it. Give yourself a little leeway. I'm going to put aside my fabric and my template for now, but I'm going to keep these squares here. This helps me just figure out the color schemes that I want to use. First, I want to show you some ideas for found objects. So for completely found objects, I have some buttons here, and I chose this one because it's a fall color. This one's kind of interesting. It's a shell. That always makes me think of autumn, just natural materials. I have some wooden shapes here. These are just some leaves. They were a table scatter. These are some leaves that were just shapes. And again, you want to make sure that they'll fit on your piece. I have this beautiful burlap flower, and again, that's a nice element for fall. It's a little thick, so I might take it apart, or I might not use it. But if you don't mind the dimension, go ahead and use that. I have a little metal charm here, and then I have some used postage stamps, and I purposely leave a little more paper than the stamp when I save them, because if I'm going to use this, and I happen to love these colors, both autumn colors here, what I do is I cut around it wide, and that would allow me to either stitch through the border or fold the border under and attach it to my piece. So I have that little stamp, and I can really just play around with the shape. So that's a cute little thing that I could add to my piece. I can add it just like that, or I can add an additional border around it. And we'll play around with that when we actually start to create our little sampler squares. The other objects are found objects with just slight modifications. So a little piece of lace that you trim down to size or you layer. This is a piece of trim shaped in like leaves. So I'd go in with my scissors and cut out the leaf shape that I wanted, or make a cluster of leaves. So it requires just a little bit of work to get it to work on your piece. Here's a piece of trim that again I strategically cut out. It has a little texture and a little color. This is a broken knob from something. I saved it because I thought it was a very interesting shape and whatnot, and I could attach that as well. Again, it's a little dimensional, but that might not be so bad. I have this little charm from a pendant. Thought that was kind of very pretty. Little cat on a moon. And this is from an old set of earrings. I bent off the piece here, but I could use this as well. I just love that rich color. I have some ribbons, and you might want to just make a little tab. So maybe fold it or use it as a layering piece. And then just some broken jewelry. You can take a piece. You could use this in entirety if you wanted to take up 2 squares, or you can take it apart. The colors are just lovely and luscious. I have some other ribbon. It's nice and thick as well. And these colors are so autumnal. I just think they're beautiful. So I'll put that in my pile of things to use. And then lastly, I want to show you some objects that you can create. Some are from previous videos. So I have a video where I show how to use rub-ons on fabric. This is a great piece because I can just cut it out and attach it to one of my backings, or even make it the entire square itself. I would just trace around the template to get my image, and then I can use it in my sampler. And here's another version of that rub-on. Again, I can cut it to size. I have a little fabric bead. I have a couple of videos on different techniques to make these. They're very handy because they add a little dimension. They're soft and squishy, and they're really cute. I think that'll be nice. I have a little apple slice here. I have a little video on this where I show making the whole apple. Then I have a video on making a snippet roll. So that's kind of an autumnal image as well. You can make little words out of text where you stitch. I think that's kind of cute to throw in a few of those. I like to use my orts, my leftover threadlings from projects, and I just sew them into different shapes. Here's one from a previous video where I showed it making into a heart shape. Another video is to use a cluster of fabric. I combine lace and buttons. You can just combine fabric. It's totally up to you. Then I have just a folded fabric flower. I have a few videos on making fabric flowers, and I'll link them all below. Then I have this knotted rose. I think that's kind of pretty as well. I'll link the video for that. And it just adds a little dimension. You can make this any size you want, and you can vary the fabric that you use. I have a few techniques I want to show you, and just some things to look for as well. So if you have autumn fabric that has either images that you like to use, or perhaps text or colors, this is a great thing to use in your work. You just need a little swatch of it that you can attach to your pieces. And it gives another effect, and it pulls in that autumn theme. Likewise, if you have some autumnal fabric, like this one with the leaves, I can cut out a leaf and use that as well. I can even wrinkle the leaf when I'm stitching it down. And then you just have some very pretty autumn fabric. It just gives a different color and a little pop of something interesting. And lastly, if you have selvage, that has the edging here with the different colors that's used in the particular print. That's something interesting to use in your work. If you get the right combination of colors, it really stands out and adds interest into your piece. So let's get started creating some of these little sampler squares here. So one of the fun things to do for a sampler square is to take a circle. This is part of a keychain, but you could use a washer. You could use a piece of cardboard that you cut out. And we're just going to wrap it. I've threaded it through a tapestry needle because it is a big eye. And you'll need quite a bit of embroidery floss, at least a yard. Now I purposely chose an autumn color. And all I'm going to do is come up through the hoop, the circle. These come in lots of sizes, as do washers, and washers are very inexpensive and easy. And I like to start out by just making a knot. That just anchors my thread in place. So I make that knot, and now I'm just going to stitch around over and over again. And I'm just wrapping the embroidery floss around this piece here. And I want to cover up all that metal and just have the wrapped ring as my end result. So I'll continue wrapping and show you how this looks. So after I have all my wraps around the little ring, I have my tail from where I started, and I have the end of the thread, the parts I didn't use. I'll clip off my thread, and now I'll just make a simple knot here. Now I like to keep the thread attached because I use this to attach it to my backing. I can just stitch around it and that will hold it onto the piece. So right now it's a ring on a string, but when I stitch it down, I'll use this extra floss to attach it. So that works out very well. You could do a whole sampler just of different rings of different colors. I think it's quite lovely. Another technique to work on is a little fabric cluster. So to make the fabric cluster, you'll need scraps of fabric. Here's a little bit of the beige that I have here that I think will tie it all together. I have some extra lace I think I'll cut up and use, some muslin, and just a little yellow, slightly off of this color, but it's very autumnal and it'll tie it all together. So I'm going to start with a backing, and I'm going to choose this brown. This is going to be a fabric cluster that I'm going to make instead of a piece that I'm just going to attach to it. So I have that. I might take a little more of this just to add additional layers. And then I do the same thing here. I'll cut a little piece. I can even fold it over if I want. And I love that edge. So now I'm just kind of piecing together something. Cut this up. And I'm just creating a little fabric collage, a little cluster of different images, different textures. It's not very thick. I think I'll open this up, sandwich this piece in. This way I get the fold of the muslin and that raw edge of that color. I like how that's coming out already. Got just a little bit of the back peeking through. So I think I'll add a little piece of this. Or maybe I'll layer it in between. I do like layers. And I'll put a little piece of this on top. So I'll cut it apart. Might be a little big with all the cluster. So I'll set this aside and just use this cluster as it is. So I have this cluster, and I'll just stitch it down with some interesting stitches, holding everything together in place. So I found a little green button here, and I think I'll just incorporate it using that same thread. I'll line it up and just stitch it down. And there I have a little sampler piece that I can attach to my sampler. So now let's use this little lace piece in our work here. I think it's just so beautiful, the contrast with one of these colors. So let me play around with it and see which one. So there's not a lot of contrast there. A little bit of contrast there. That looks good too. But I think I like it against that dark green. So now I'm just going to use a couching stitch and stitch all around. I can decide which side I want to show on the top. I think I want this side. And because this is a crocheted flower, I can move it and maneuver it into position and then stitch it down to hold that shape. So that's just what I'll do. So I stitched it down. You can see it's nice and flat. It's a very interesting texture. If I flip it over, you can see my stitches and just a little goof that I made. Didn't realize it until it was halfway stitched down. I have two pieces of fabric here holding it in place, and that's totally fine. So as you can see, I'm starting to come along with all these matching and coordinating pieces, but they're all interesting and different. Let's work on another one here. I have some beautiful fabric here. This is velvet. I don't usually work with velvet, but I had it left over from my crazy quilt block, and I don't want to get rid of velvet. It's gorgeous. Additionally, that color coordinates with this little piece of trim I have. So that is 2 different squares for the sampler, and it pulls the color together. So I think I'm going to cut just a simple shape to use in my work here. And I have lots of options. I can do a heart or a round object. I can make a leaf shape. I think I want to stick with those rounds that I'm doing here. I have the round button. I have the round little mini doily. So I'm going to choose a color for my fabric backing. I think I'll go with this beautiful pattern. And I'll just cut a round shape. So I need something that I can trace around to get that image, that right size. I can do it on the back of this piece. One thing I like to use for circles are just round caps. So I have this little round cap here. I like that size. I think it'll fit well on the piece. Just trace around and cut it out, and then I'll stitch it down. So I have that nice round shape. I can just stitch it down, can layer it if I wanted. But I think I'm going to save this and use this on a different square. I'm just going to take some embroidery floss that coordinates with it and make little stitches to stitch it down. So here we have the little circle stitched. You can see my stitches on the back, and it's very interesting. In person, it's very textured and it goes very nicely. Let's make one of these flowers. It's kind of an interesting effect. You'll need a strip of fabric. You can either cut the edge or tear the edge. I'm going to use my pinking shears. Just going to cut the edge here. And now I'm just going to cut the inside at an angle on both sides. I have many fabric flowers videos, but I just think this is kind of an interesting technique. You'll need some embroidery floss. So now this is a lot taller than the flower is going to be. So I'm just going to fold the edge over here, just at the bottom. This will cut the size down a little bit. And starting at one end, it doesn't matter which end, I'm going to tuck it and fold it. And I'll take my needle through there just to hide the knot, and then come out the bottom. And now I can just tuck and fold over and over again. And after I have about 3 folds, I'll bring my needle through, again making sure everything lines up nicely. And again the same thing, fold it a few times. And I want to just leave a little bit at the end so that I can tuck it again. And this is just so I'm tucking that raw edge. So I tuck it under. And then I stitch it into place. So now I have the top part of my flower. You could play around with how much it opens up. You can trim it some more if you don't want any of that fabric showing. I don't particularly mind. So now I have the little open part of my flower. And then I'm going to take a strip of this green. I'm going to fold it on itself. A couple of times I'll roll it together. And now I'm attaching it. So I'm holding it on the back here, stitch through it, maybe a couple of times just to really anchor it in place. And again, it's a little challenging to stitch through all these layers, so just take your time. And I'll bring this fabric over and I'll stitch through there again. And I'll just continue to wrap it around. I'll make sure my thread goes through the top of that fabric, and then I'll knot off my thread. I have a little bit of an interesting flower that I can stitch down on one of these squares. Lastly, I want to prepare a few pieces, and I'll attach them in the next video to my sampler, to the backing piece. So I'll start with this little burlap flower. As I said, I love it, but it's a little thick, a little two-dimensional. So I'll just take it apart. Now it might be damaged, so I might not be able to use it, but I'm going to see what I can come up with. Burlap's tricky to use because if you just go to cut burlap, it tends to run and fray. It's not very friendly that way. So that's why when I see flowers or different burlap shapes that have the edges all done, I like to use that. So that's just a little less dimension. And I like that. I can even try and take off this little piece and stitch a button or something inside of it. So let me try that. Let me try and remove that center piece. May have to cut it out. It's just held on by some hot glue. And then maybe I could put this little center in there with a few stitches. So that's another piece, and that ties it together. I have these couple of little words. I have these couple of little words I'm going to use. I think I'm going to add a postage stamp. I have this rub-on butterfly. I love those colors. I have a few leaves, play around with that as well. I have this little knotted rose. I need 16 pieces, but there's lots that I can play with and come up with. I also have my fabric that I wanted to work with. I'm going to use this little selvage here. I think I'll use numbers 1 through 4. We'll see how that goes. It's a cute little square. I can fold it over or add a little piece of lace. So that's a nice idea. I have a little fabric bead. I'll add that. And I have pieces of ribbon. I love the colors here. So now I have a nice array of pieces. I also have some textured ribbon. I have this little found object. It goes with the purple, so that's 3 purple. I kind of like that. And I'll see what I can come up with. Maybe I'll use this little apple or a button. But in the next video, we'll assemble our sampler with the pieces that we made and the pieces that we found.
So that's how I create the blocks to use in my sampler. The next stage of the process is the design work, and that's really enjoyable. You get to play around with where you want the shapes, what colors you want, and then when you think you have it all settled, well, another idea will pop into your head, and I'll show you how I go through my process in the next video. If you found today's video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. And if you'd like additional content behind the scenes and extra videos, please become a paid member of my channel. Thanks for watching today.